According to the time-stamped listing photos, this KTM 1290 Super Adventure R has been at the salvage yard for 2 years to the month, and at first glance, it looks flawless.
So why doesn't anyone want it? I mean, it's not old. It's a 2021 model.
It's not high mileage with just 22,000 kilometers on it. The bodywork looks good in the photos. The dash isn't cracked. In fact, it doesn't look like it was in a crash at all.
And it's selling for about 50% less than a normal second-hand Super Adventure like this.
But then I saw what was missing. The chain. I can only assume that means it snapped while riding.
And when a chain snaps, it can do some serious damage.
Yet, it didn't look bad in the photos, although there is oil sitting in the bash plate.
Why wouldn't the insurance company fix it then? How did it end up in a salvage yard?
So I went to look at it.
I took a gamble and bought it, but I might have made a huge mistake because it turns out the crankcase is damaged.
So come with me as I try to fix this beast of an adventure bike that ends up sending me on a bit of an adventure trying to fix it.
That bearing is not on the clutch parts diagram. Well, this was supposed to be the part of the video where I take it on an off-road adventure to Starbucks, but unfortunately it's kind of stuck in limp mode. I mean, it even struggles to get up a hill like this.
Thank you to CHIGEE for adding even more tech to my new adventure bike and for sponsoring this video.
I am not much of an adventure bike guy. You can tell by how the Super Adventure is bigger than I am. I spend my time rebuilding naked bikes and sport bikes, and ever since I broke my back just 1 week after my first ever motocross race, I tried to avoid riding on the dirt.
Nevertheless, I love all motorcycles, and I'm a sucker for an affordable project. Plus, I hate to admit it, but after spending some time with the new 1300 GS Adventure, the idea of a luxurious adventure bike started to sound more and more appealing.
I've been keeping my eye on this Super Adventure for around 8 months now. So when the price dropped by almost $3,000 the other day, I knew it was time to go have a little look.
I got distracted right away by this G-Wagon and an RS6 Avant, but after a closer inspection of my bank account, I quickly returned to the Super Adventure, surrounded by a group of decaying motorcycles. The bike was in a rough part of town, so I took my father-in-law with me. I told him I needed him as backup, but the truth is, I just knew I could run away faster than he could if someone tried to kidnap us.
Nevertheless, the bike and I are now home. Unfortunately, my father-in-law did get kidnapped, so I guess it was lucky that I took him with. But now, let me show you the missing pieces, the problems, and the real damage with my Super Adventure. I'll go from the easiest things to fix to the things that might be impossible to fix. First of all, it's really dirty. It almost looks like no one has washed it or ridden it in the last 2 years, but luckily it was stored inside because some salvage yards are outdoors, and then it would look 10 times worse with rusting brake discs. But at least no matter what, the chain wouldn't have rusted. Next, the tires are really soft, which made it even heavier to load. It also doesn't switch on. Luckily, it was switched on in the listing photos, so it should just be a flat battery. The key fob battery looks fine judging by this red light. I think it must have had a full set of luggage installed on it at the time of the incident, like a full set of panniers and a top box, because you can see here where these exposed bolt holes are, there should be like plastic pieces here for aesthetics, and I think you would have to remove those to install luggage racks. You can also see these bolts here have been used like a top box was installed. And lastly, the passenger foot pegs are still loose, like someone was taking off luggage racks in a hurry. I also only realized when I got the bike home that this is the wrong exhaust pipe. Here is what the stock pipe is supposed to look like on these bikes, and this one is actually from the previous generation 1290 Super Adventure, or possibly even an 1190. So it clearly had an aftermarket pipe on it at the time of the incident that he took off, but how it ended up with this exhaust, I have no idea. There's also a button on the switch gear here that is snapped off. It is, however, a really fragile button that sticks out far too much, so I'm not surprised. And then there's the real problem. When the chain snapped, it ripped the hydraulic clutch slave cylinder straight off. And the problem is that the mounting points for this attach to the crankcase. So you can see the 3 mounting points there that are still attached to this chain guard. And they're supposed to attach there, there, and down there. This push rod here is also bent. This is supposed to be straight. And lastly, there's an oil seal here that got damaged. So now there's a whole bunch of oil sitting in the bash plate here, which I think makes this whole thing look a lot worse than it actually is. Now, I'll be honest, I have never done extensive work on a clutch before, especially not a hydraulic clutch. The most I've done is take clutch plates out and put them back in. And I actually bled a hydraulic clutch for the first time ever just the other day. So after looking at this bike for the first time, I had to go and do my homework. But now I think we have a couple options to fix this. But first, I want to confirm the mileage on this bike, and I would like to hear it run, because there's no point fixing it if it doesn't run.
It's always a good idea to start with an easy fix to raise your confidence before the big problems make you regret your life choices. So with that in mind, I made the bike easier to push around by inflating the tires and my confidence at the same time. Plus, I'm sure it needs some chain lube after 2 years. Oh, right.
Something tells me we're gonna need a new tire as well. Is that what 160 horsepower does to an off-road tire? There's just chunks out of it everywhere. You know, I thought I had this mechanic thing down. When the bike doesn't switch on, it's probably in this case because the battery's flat. So I assume the battery is under the seat. So you take the seat off and charge the battery, easy. Except that the release for the seat is a button. You can't just put a key in it and twist. And an electronic button requires power. And to give the bike power, I need to get the seat off. I feel like I'm just going in a loop here.
Luckily, I'm not the first person to have this issue on the internet, and KTM did think about this problem. So it turns out there's a cable underneath this panel to release the seat if the battery dies, and voila, there is the culprit. But even after putting the battery on charge, there was a problem. My battery charger said it was already fully charged, and nothing changed after waiting a few hours, so I went and grabbed a new one instead.
I've got the key, there should be power now, so let's see what it does. It's ready to race, and there we go, 22,309 kilometers. Not only that, we got a free tank of fuel. I mean, it's 2 years old now, which means it will have gone bad and we have to throw it out, but I'm counting it as a win.
I've never ridden one of these before, but this big screen looks brilliant with all the cool graphics, and the amount of tech and settings is honestly a little overwhelming, yet it is already getting me excited to ride it.
On second thought, I'm not gonna start it. The oil level looks pretty low, and I'm not sure if oil's just gonna come squirting out of there or not. I'm new to clutches. From my research, we have 2 options to fix this. Option 1 is the correct way, aka to replace the broken crankcase. Now, the crankcase is 2 pieces that perfectly mate together. They get bolted together, and sandwiched in between those pieces is the majority of your engine, like the crankshaft, the gearbox, and so on. So to replace that comes with a few problems. Firstly, it's expensive. I got a quote for just the cases from KTM, and because they made together perfectly, you couldn't just buy the left-hand side one. You have to buy them as a pair. And just that is $2,200 US. Problem 2 is that it's difficult To rebuild an engine is kind of above my pay grade. The furthest I've ever gone is a timing chain and a piston, for example. You would also need a lot of special tools to rebuild an engine that I don't have. Now, this would be the approach the insurance company would have to take, which is possibly how this bike ended up in a salvage yard, because to pay for all the parts you need to replace is one thing, but the most expensive part will probably be labor, because it's going to take a long time to rebuild an engine like this. Option 2 is the backyard mechanic method, or the budget method, aka welding it. Now, I've gotten mixed messages about whether this is possible to weld or not. Apparently it is a complex alloy and it's a porous metal, so it might be difficult to weld. However, I sent photos to a motorcycle machine shop that I've used in the past, and he says he can weld it. Now, this isn't just somebody's uncle or neighbor with a welder. This is somebody who I trust and has very likely done this exact fix in the past. And to be honest, I've got nothing to lose. It's not like I can damage the crankcases any further. In the past, I've been an advocate for sparing no expense and doing things by the book when it comes to repairing motorcycles. I mean, I've even replaced entire frames in the past. So I think I'm going to treat this bike more like an experiment. I'm going to go for the repair as opposed to replace approach and see if it pays off. After all, a slave cylinder isn't exactly a high stress area. And if the repair were to fail, you would just lose your clutch. You're not going to die, hopefully.
Now the fun begins. It's always interesting stripping a bike for the first time. You hardly ever do it in the most efficient way possible, but it's the only way to learn. Well, I guess there is the owner's manual, but that is for people who can read, not illiterate YouTubers. And yes, illiterate is spelled wrong in my script. Nevertheless, the crash bars were straightforward, as was the bash plate, which is good because I suspect you'd have to remove both of those things every time you change the oil. And I actually found the chain link that snapped in the bash plate. I've never seen half a chain link before. And this is a very good example of why you should tension your chain properly, wax it regularly, keep an eye out for seized links or tight spots, and replace it at the right time. Basically all the things I don't do.
Seeing how these bikes are built is actually really interesting. I mean, I've always known that they have a sort of fuel bladder low down here to keep the center of gravity nice and low and to improve handling and whatnot. But what I didn't realize was that it went all the way up the side like this. There's basically two of these bladders, one on each side of the bike. And to be honest, I thought they just kept a little bit of fuel down here and most of it was still in your normal fuel tank position. I honestly thought it was just like a marketing gimmick, but seeing it like this puts it into perspective. I mean, look at these hoses here, I assume to guide the fuel from the filler cap down into here. And then at the bottom on each of these, there's a fuel pump like this. I also found this, what it looks like a drain valve here. So I think we should drain the fuel now since it's going to be too old to use anyway. And that way the tanks will be lighter to take them off. But damn, it needs a wash.
Those valves are actually petcocks, and the two tanks are connected to each other at the bottom by a hose to keep the fuel level even between the two tanks. So the petcock is to stop the fuel flow when removing the tanks like I am. However, I was able to detach the hose that connects the tanks and use the petcocks to drain all 23 liters of fuel, which took a while. At first, I thought I had to remove the tanks and leave the filler cap, but after a bit more tinkering, I realized I could remove the whole tank in one go. It was a bit awkward, but I got it off in the end.
So now this area is at least a bit more accessible for welding, but I think we should still take all of the damaged parts off.
Since the fluid had already drained itself, it was easy to disconnect the clutch line from the slave cylinder.
So at first I was going to disassemble this, take it apart, but to be honest, if I was the welder, even though I can't weld, I would want to see it just like this, to see which stump went where and to see how this is assembled. So I think I'm just going to leave it like this and give it to him like this.
Next, the sprocket is somewhat in the way, and we're going to be replacing the sprockets when we install the new chain anyway, so I took it off as well as the gear lever. The kickstand kill switch and gear position sensor wires pass right where welding is going to take place, which would melt the wires pretty easily. So I disconnected them, removed the kickstand completely with the wire, and routed the other wire out of the way. Although this would prove pointless.
Well, I still don't think this area is going to be easy to access, but it is a lot more accessible than it was at the start of today. So all that's left before we take it to the machine shop is to get this bent rod out, which I think is easier said than done considering it comes out the other side of the engine.
I went around the other side of the engine to remove the clutch cover so we could see the other end of the pushrod, all while forgetting something pretty important.
Oh dear, that was smart of me.
It's not often a KTM needs human intervention to create an oil leak, but one entire roll of paper towel later, I had the bright idea of draining the oil. And although the oil does look very black and in need of changing, I think it's pretty much all there, which makes me less worried about the engine running while it was low on oil. So with the clutch cover now removed in a much tidier manner, you can see each side of the pushrod wiggle when I move it around. But the pressure plate is still in the way. Next, that bent piece was stopping it from coming out, so I cut it off as delicately as possible. But still, it wouldn't budge as is, so I turned to a hammer and screwdriver, which did the trick in no time at all. I loosely put it back together for the time being, cleaned up the oily area, which made it look a million times better, removed the battery since I've heard that welding a vehicle with the battery connected can fry the ECU, and tightened up those loose passenger foot pegs, so I feel like I've at least completed one job today despite still having an unrideable bike. Finally, since this exhaust isn't going to work for us, I carefully removed it. Then loaded up the Super Adventure and dropped it off at the machine shop before stopping by KTM to order all the parts I'm going to need.
And after 17 days of wondering if it is possible to weld or not, it's back. And this is how the repair looks. This is how I got it back from the machine shop. Now keep in mind, these are the old parts. This is the whole assembly that I gave to the machinist with those broken off stumps. And we'll take this off in a minute to have a look behind it properly, but this is essentially how it's going to look when it's all put back together and working. And from this angle, you wouldn't be able to tell that anything ever happened. Of course, if you look a bit closer, you can make out a weld there. And from below here, it really isn't the prettiest. But like the machinist said, as soon as you put the chain back on and all the parts back on, you get a bit of chain lube flung around and the area gets dirty, you'll never even notice. I've also now got all the parts I think I'm going to need. So these are the parts from KTM. These are the plastics where I think the panniers were mounted. And these are all the other parts like that push rod that we need to repair the clutch. I've also got everything I need to do an oil change because the poor thing hasn't had one in 2 years. I don't know if you remember, but it was missing a chain. And it's always a good idea to do sprockets and a chain at the same time, even though I don't usually do that myself. And lastly, I got some rear brake pads because I saw the ones on the Super Adventure are basically finished. Oh, and I almost forgot that I also got it a new rear tire, and I decided to treat it to a second-hand Akrapovic. Well, actually, I kind of got suckered into that, but I'll get to that.
As always, I started with an easy problem and installed these plastic grab handle things. But first, I cleaned the area behind them. And all this time, these white areas have looked scratched. But fortunately, it was mostly dirt, and they cleaned up very well.
The next problem that I want to solve is this switchgear broken button. You can see the button here for C1 and C2 has actually snapped off. Now you can still press it, but it's obviously not how it's supposed to be. And to replace the entire switchgear, even with a second-hand unit, is really expensive. I know because I had to do that on my Super Duke project over here. This one originally had a sticky kill switch button, so I bought this second-hand one to replace it. However, this was lying on my bench and I realized that it still has the C1 and C2 button here. And if you look underneath, with it opened up, it looks like I can just pull it off and we should be able to put it onto the Super Adventure switchgear. How cool is that? I actually had a part in stock. That's never happened to me before.
Gaining access to the switchgear was the first challenge, and I tried to take a shortcut by attempting to do the swap with the switchgear still plugged into the bike. But while disassembling the donor switchgear, I realized that it wasn't very difficult at all to disassemble. So I repeated the process over at the bike, and in just a few minutes, it was good as new.
Now let's get the rear wheel off, because then we can solve 3 problems in one go. Change the rear sprocket, put the new tire on, and the new rear brake pads.
It sounds easy, but there's always something that doesn't go to plan.
Whoever owned this bike really liked to use every last piece of their parts. I mean, they used literally the entire chain, and look at this rear brake pad. It's almost metal on metal.
I took the opportunity to clean up the caliper as well as the inside of the swing arm, and the brake pad change went to plan. The sprocket change, however, was more fiddly. The combination of strong Loctite and studs with oval heads wasn't fun. I tried to soften the Loctite with a heat gun, which definitely helped. But either way, these studs that are designed to press against the sprocket just deform the sprocket with the added resistance of Loctite. Luckily, the only damage was to the old sprocket, so it didn't really matter. I also removed this ugly rim tape, which was already peeling. Then I figured I should fix the clutch before installing the front sprocket and chain, so there is plenty of space to work. And this was my first real look at the welding. And I have to say, after cleaning it up, it isn't very pretty, but nowhere near as bad as it could be either. And as long as it's strong, I don't care. This damaged oil seal had to be removed first, so I used a screwdriver and hammer to deform its metal ring so it could pop out with relative ease. However, that revealed a damaged bearing that I didn't know existed and hadn't prepared for. I thought I'd ordered all the parts I would need.
But that bearing is not on the clutch parts diagram. You can see here is the push rod, there's a seal, a guide, the slave cylinder, everything that I ordered, and this is what I went by. And there's no bearing, but eventually I did find it on the transmission parts diagram. Here it is on the main shaft of the transmission. I then ran around trying to find a replacement bearing, and I was able to. And I actually bought 3 of them. The other 2 are just currently in the freezer, because if you buy 1, you will break it while installing it. The same goes if you buy 2, but if you buy 3, you won't break any. That's my logic, at least. However, the part I'm most worried about is getting that old damaged bearing out. So I bought this. This is a bearing puller with this cool slide hammer. And to be honest, I love buying new tools, and this is probably something I should have had already. So I really hope it makes my life easier today.
You simply insert the 3 prongs into the middle of the bearing and then screw in the shaft, which expands the prongs inside the bearing, gripping it tightly. Then you use the slide hammer to drive it out. At least that's the theory, but in reality it doesn't work at first. So you use every tool you own and eventually you get the little bastard out. Even if it isn't pretty. But that is only half the job done, so I cleaned up my mess, got my bearing out of the freezer that has hopefully contracted, heated up the area in the hopes it expands, and used a socket and hammer to seat the new bearing. Also, please note this whole process contained a lot more cursing than this video shows. Nevertheless, the new oil seal went in the same way, but a lot easier. So all that was left to do was install all the new parts. I even had to replace the slave cylinder, since the original one is in a few more pieces than it should be. Then it was honestly pretty simple. Remove the pressure plate, oil up the push rod and slide it through the engine. Then there's this needle that slides through the push rod and seats in this guide, before the chain guard gets sandwiched between the engine and slave cylinder. So I can reattach the clutch line. But we still don't have a clutch.
Interestingly, I see that the clutch master cylinder on the Super Adventure here is a sort of all-in-one design, whereas the Super Duke over here is different. This one has an external reservoir and it's a different master cylinder, even though the slave cylinders are exactly the same. Now, I was actually struggling to bleed this clutch until I bled the bleed nipple on the master cylinder. And I don't see a bleed nipple on this all-in-one master cylinder design. So I really hope it's not difficult to get pressure.
For some reason, there was a bit of sludge in the reservoir, but once that was cleaned out, I used my vacuum pump to bleed the clutch. And within seconds, the clutch was working for the first time in 2 years.
Okay, that is looking promising. It's the first time we've ever had a clutch lever on this bike, but we still don't know if it runs. And unfortunately, there is probably some metal in the engine due to that bearing incident. So I think let's get it to a point where we can start it so we can do a few oil flushes to get the metal out.
I am clueless when it comes to adventure bike tires, so I just got the same Pirelli that was already on there, and I hope it's decent. There's nothing stickier than the shipping grease on new chains, so I washed that off before installing the new sprocket and chain. I got my wife to stand on the rear brake while I torqued the front sprocket nut to 100 Newton meters. And for some reason, I'm taking chain tension very seriously on this bike, although KTM do try to help with this tension guide on the swing arm. While reinstalling the kickstand, I noticed that somewhere along the line, the gear position sensor wires had gotten damaged, I'm not sure if it happened in transit, at the machine shop, or if it was my doing, but I didn't think much of it at the time and simply repaired them. But boy, would this turn into a big problem. The previous owner definitely enjoyed this bike to its full potential, because there's sand in every crevice. So I gave the tank a wipe down before reinstalling it, which should help me sleep better at night.
Now, while the bike was away getting welded, the exhaust was confusing the hell out of me. If you remember, it had this on it when I got it, and this is actually the stock silencer from the previous generation 1290 and 1190 by the looks of things. So I wanted to get something more fitting because I think this looks hideous and it's not supposed to be on the bike. So I got this for really cheap. This is the stock silencer for this exact bike. So although it isn't as cool as an aftermarket pipe, I thought it would at least look more fitting. But when I was getting it home, I realized the size difference between this hole and this hole. And I remembered that my clamp did go around here. So how the hell is this big? But eventually I worked out that someone must have altered these headers. They cut the cat out, put this link pipe on so that they could install other silencers that don't have that gigantic hole on them. But either way, I still needed a solution if I didn't want to run that ugly silencer. So I found a set of stock headers at a bike breaker and went to buy those. Except when I got there, they'd already sold them. They did, however, have this Acra, which is actually off of the previous generation 1290 Adventure, which means that the hole here is the exact size of my link pipe. It was, however, way too long at first. It was sitting about back here. So I dropped it off at the machine shop. They slightly shortened the silencer, slightly altered the link pipe, and now this is going to look and sound a lot better.
In order to hear the Acra in action for the first time, I put some cheaper oil in since we're going to drain it right away to flush out any metal. And once we had power and fuel, it was the moment of truth.
Now we need to see if it runs. And I'm not going to lie, it's always a little nerve-wracking to start a salvage bike for the first time.
I always fear that there was another reason a bike was taken off the road that I missed. But the Super Adventure didn't miss a beat. It started up like it had run just the other day, not 2 years ago. So with that stress out of the way, I let it run for a few minutes, drained the oil, and repeated the process. On the third time, I also swapped out the filter for a new one and refilled it with some more expensive oil since it's going to stick around for a bit longer. Now that there are no more holes in the engine, it's finally time to get 2 years of dust off. For now, I left the plastics, crash cage and bash guard off so I can get all the sand out of the nooks and crannies, as well as oil residue off the engine. This whole time, I thought the Super Adventure had quite a few scratches and blemishes, but to my surprise, most of them washed off with little effort, and back inside, there was just one more important job to do. Or so I thought. The Super Adventure obviously has a ton of technology, like tire pressure monitoring, cruise control, it can connect to your phone, and so on. But there are certain things it's missing.
It doesn't have Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. It doesn't have dash cams front and rear. It doesn't have blind spot detection. And it doesn't have an SOS feature. But with my CHIGEE AI06, I can have all of those things on any bike,
including optional TPMS with these valve caps. So I installed it on the Super Adventure, and although I have a crossbar mount for my CHIGEE, which would be perfect for an adventure bike, the Super Adventure doesn't actually have a crossbar, so I had to use the handlebar mount instead. I guess a GS wins that battle, since the CHIGEE is compatible with BMW's Cradle, so you could even control it with their Wonder Wheel.
Obviously, all of those features I just mentioned are optional, so you can pick and choose what you do or don't want. But it's a great way to modernize any bike. And if there's one bike that you should have navigation on, it's an adventure bike. So if you also want to modernize your bike, you can get 10% off the AI06 with code CHAOS10. And here it is. I honestly hate this color scheme, but it is really cool to see it out here in the world, especially considering that it's been stuck in a salvage yard for the last 2 years. There are, however, a few big problems. Well, this was supposed to be the part of the video where I take it on an off-road adventure to Starbucks, like a good adventure bike owner. But unfortunately, it's kind of stuck in limp mode. I mean, it even struggles to get up a hill like this, which is really bad for a bike that's supposed to have 160 horsepower. Let's start with the good things then, shall we? For starters, the clutch feels exactly how you would expect. I was a bit worried that it would feel kinda off, but it pulls off perfectly. It goes in and out of gear exactly like you want it to. And to be honest, you can't even see the repair. It also sounds fantastic. But the best part is that it's only cost me about $600 to repair. That's obviously the replacement parts and the welding, but it also includes things like the rear tire, the brake pads, oil, and so on. But it is excluding the exhaust because that was purely for fun. All in all, I'm about $8,400 into the bike. So I think if I were to sell it, I could make about $3,000 in profit. But at the moment, I'm not sure if I like the idea of a fancy, cheap adventure bike or profit more. But of course, that only matters if it runs properly. And at the moment, it doesn't.
It's currently got a cruise control error, a traction control error. It doesn't show me what gear I'm in, which also means the quick shifter doesn't work, and the bike is in limp mode.
At first, I thought it was due to those damaged wires on the gear position sensor that I repaired. So I repaired them again, but I still have the same issue. After doing a bit of research, it looks like all these issues are probably linked, and they could be solved by KTM simply calibrating the gear position sensor. They did the same thing on my Super Duke, but that means I would have to take the bike to KTM, which is really frustrating. But if that is the problem, it could be an easy fix.
The next day, I did exactly that. And after KTM calibrated a new gear position sensor, the bike was back to 160 horsepower, plus with all the expected features working once again, so I could take it for a real test. A bike this big and with this much power doesn't deserve to be so competent and fun off-road, which is kind of why it's so cool. I would love to attach some panniers and find the most scenic dirt roads in the country. Or maybe I've just been watching too much YouTube.
But anyway, let me know if you would have taken a chance on this super adventure. Don't forget to check out CHIGEE, and I'll see you on the next ride.